This week on To the Contrary.
First, this Father's Day, we take a look at the state of the world's fathers with a panel of fathers. Then, the progress of the UN's HeForShe campaign and a woman's face on the $10 bill.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. We begin with the first State of the World's Fathers Report. Around the globe, fathers' roles are changing rapidly. According to the Men Care campaign, which produced the report, fathers can be vital in achieving gender equality, but only with the right support.
We wanted to put out a kind of a global call for how do we get men more involved in caregiving.
Gary Barker is a father and the founder of Promundo, one of the nonprofit organizations behind the Men Care campaign.
The world doesn't pay a lot of attention to men's participation in the care of children.
Some 80% of men will become fathers, and what it means to be a father is evolving. But government policy, public discourse, and research projects are not always keeping up. The Men Care campaign was designed to bridge the gap with an in-depth report on fatherhood across the world.
In spite of all the research in child development, gender equality, women's time use, and the care burden on women, we don't really measure or count men's. So one finding is that we don't have nearly as much information as we need.
Why is it important for fathers to play a role in their children's life?
Although we don't think about it as much, men matter a huge amount for whether children finish school, whether their sons believe in gender equality and respecting women, whether their daughters are empowered. No matter where we look on the data, men do matter for the lives of their children.
Not only does involved fatherhood help children, it helps fathers themselves.
Men who report close relationships with children, whether they're biological or otherwise, or some kind of other caregiving relationship with someone where they're responsible for doing the care, they're healthier, they're happier, their mental health is better, they're less likely to abuse drugs and other substances.
New data tell us fathers' bodies release hormones when in contact with children in the same way we knew mothers' bodies react.
Anyone who wants to say, well, really women are naturally better at it, well, women have been doing it for far longer, but men are just as naturally capable of it as women are. We need men to go home and say the life at home matters as much as what you do outside the home, and so at the workplace, in the spaces where we give men and women, kudos for what they do outside the home, we also need to say, go home, you are done here. You have folks waiting for you, go be with them.
Barker has some suggestions for fathers to help them be part of the solution.
Put the time in. Frankly, by being present in the everyday tasks of caring for children, we're contributing to gender equality. We're contributing to sons who believe that women and men are equal. We're contributing to empowered daughters who don't think that their role is only to be a caregiver. We empower our partners to have the full lives that they deserve, for their pay to equal ours, for their space in the public eye to be as big as ours is as men. We're so used to, as fathers, kind of arriving for the fun stuff. And I'd say in much of the world it's still, dad arrives in its playtime, and that's a fantastic thing we should do, and that's, certainly as a father, one of the most meaningful things in my life is, those moments. But also to say it's the daily care that we also have to put our hands in and do.
This week for Father's Day, we've assembled an all-male, all-dad panel. Joe Jones is the founder of the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore. Chris Johnson serves on the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. David Martosko, political editor at the Daily Mail, and Colby King, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post. So Joe Jones, first of all, according to this report, how quickly are fathers really getting involved in daily care, and is it fast enough for you?
Well, I think it's definitely a difference from just 5 to 10 years ago when it was almost odd to see a guy being a caregiver, you know, with the device, I forget what you call it, where he can carry the baby on the front.
Sling.
The conversation among men is changing in terms of if a dad is home with his child, he's no longer babysitting, he's actually parenting, and changing that narrative. And if you look at last year's Super Bowl as an example, there were multiple ads that focus on the positive narrative around fathers and involved in the lives of their children. And so I think, you know, what we have is an opportunity to change the way in which we have socialized men in our country, going back to the founding of the country, where we were expected to go to work, to go to war, to be providers, and to be protectors. And if we did anything other than that, like being a nurturer, you were almost cast aside, you know. And so I think now we have an opportunity really to build on that narrative and to make sure that dads are really recognized for the complementary value they bring to working with moms and raising our country's children.
Now, Colby, you're a grandfather of 7, so how have things changed since you were a young dad?
Actually, my life was different from a lot of the others. I grew up in a family where men had strong and very clear roles in the family, and they were caregivers. I'm talking about my grandfathers as well as my father. They also cooked. Yes, I cooked.
Other than the grill? I have to throw in that question.
I do all of the meals in the family because when my wife went into the workforce and I started looking out for the kids, and when she traveled, I would cook. At one point, the kids said to her, "Mom, don't cook anymore. We prefer Dad's cooking." And she was happy with that because she didn't like to cook anyway. The important thing about a father is a man must be there. Yep. Be there as a first step. If he's not there, all the other things that you're talking about won't work. And even if he is employed and making a lot of money, there's no compensation for his absence. No amount of money can compensate for the absence. And the presence there is what happens. That person is the model. Kids learn from what they see, how the father interacts with the mother, how the two parents interact. The role that the father plays in the house is what the kids will emulate. If the father is a caregiver, father is a nurturer, you can bet those kids will be the same way coming up.
Is that your experience, David?
Well, I had kind of varied experiences with fatherhood growing up. You know, I'm kind of estranged from my father now. There's a lot of history there, but I had grandfathers who were very traditional breadwinners, came home and had very little contact with their kids. I'm just plainly different. I swung the pendulum the other way. I mean, yes, of course, if I had a different kind of role model, I might have emulated it. But I'm doing something completely different from my own family history because I found it unsatisfactory. I'm constantly around my daughters. When I travel to cover political campaigns, each of them sends me with a stuffed animal as a proxy for them, and I take pictures of them all over the world, you know. But I think Colby's absolutely right at a very important point. I think in this country, in the United States of America, we don't suffer as much from a deficit of caregiving by fathers who are in the household. I think we suffer from a devastating deficit of fathers who are around at all. And addressing that kind of stuff will not come about through, you know, a UN-sponsored report or television shows, frankly. It'll come about when we change things like the tax code and encourage people to stay married, when we change things like the criminal justice system and program that can let fathers who made stupid mistakes with very low levels of drugs go home to their families. Those things, I think, are far more important than a report telling a lot of us what we already know, is that it matters if you show up and play with your kids and cook for them and put them to bed and read to them. You know, those are things that matter, but they only count if you're in the family in the first place.
Do you agree, Chris? And we should say you're a single dad by choice.
Yes. Yes, I have a very different experience than all of you. I'm single and I'm raising my daughter, Sophia, who's now 2.5 years old, entirely by myself. I don't have a nanny. I don't have babysitters. I do it on my own. I changed my entire life to work from home so that I could raise her hands-on. Frankly, I didn't expect it in the beginning. I really thought I'd have a nanny and a lot of support, but as soon as they put her into my arms when she was born, my heart changed completely, and I just had to take on the responsibility. And she's thriving. I mean, she is spectacular in every way, and frankly, so am I. It's changed everything about my life in the most positive manner. So this report and many of the benefits that they mentioned to fathers who are hands-on caretakers for their children are very active. I'm a living example of that truth.
Well, I have to tell you, many, many years ago, during the dot-com bust, I was in Mill Valley with one of my two best friends. We were having coffee, and in this outside this cafe where we were in a beautiful spot looking out over the water, were a whole bunch of dads with their baby carriages and their young children. And I said, Tim, look at that. You know, California's so far ahead of Washington, D.C. These kids are all being, you know, the dads are the primary caretakers. And he said, no, Bonnie, we're not so evolved, believe me. Those are the dot-com bust dads who are out of work right now. How long is it going to take? And this is, as I say, when was the dot-com bust? 15, 20 years ago. So how long is it going to take before American men get it? And what kind, you know, you're working at the very local level in certain much needed neighborhoods where your help is needed, but how long is it going to take before we see fathers evolve to the point where you train them to be?
Yeah, I think we're doing that. You need to take a quick 2-second pause. Happy Father's Day, everybody. We can't leave without doing that to ourselves. Come on now. You know, the guys I work with are low-income dads, right? And you're a data guy, so you appreciate this, right? And the 3 zip codes contiguous to where my building is, and my building, by the way, is right across the street from the church where Freddie Gray's funeral was held. So in those 3 zip codes, there are approximately 2,400 men who owe more than $20 million in back state-owed child support, right? That's debt that's associated with the mom having received public benefits for a short term. And so we have worked with our state legislature to begin to figure out how do we get the debt off the backs of those guys to get them into the labor force, but to have them pay on the original order and modify it so they can pay it based on their current income situation, and it gets adjusted as their wages increase. But to your point about family formation, one of the things that we have really argued for is the fact that when a poor woman who's in a relationship with a poor guy and they become pregnant, and they approach the welfare office for temporary assistance, the system doesn't do a good job across the country at all in engaging the guy at the time that she applies for benefits, except for the notion of connecting him to paternity establishment and child support. But what we should be doing is just have that conversation, but talk to them about them wanting to build their family and creating a place so they can be able to do it, so they can learn the relationship skills, but also deal with their economic circumstances. And I think when you bundle those together, you kind of get to the equation, particularly for that demographic.
So are you calling for changes in the welfare system generally to more support for fathers, more support to get fathers involved?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In Maryland, through the support of one of our state delegates, Delegate Sandy Rosenberg, we actually got a bill passed in the Maryland legislature that was signed by the governor, and it is requiring the state where the welfare office, child support office, and family and investment offices are co-located to work with us and the Annie Casey Foundation on the evaluation side. So we're actually moving that. Maryland House Bill 333 is now a law. And so we are really excited about that.
Explain for people who don't know exactly what you do. What does the law require?
The law requires
happen with all low-income fathers.
So it's a pilot. It requires that the state, when the mom applies for benefits, that she is eligible to come to our center with her partner, right, to go through a set of services. And there's a programmatic side to it, but the complementary side is systems change to get the bureaucratic system to engage him closer to the time she applies for benefits as opposed to after the fact. So this poor mom has to go home and have an economic conversation with the person she has a child by or was pregnant by and say, hey, I got the benefits, but I kind of had to give you up, right, as opposed to us saying, hey, I had to give them information about you, but we're also going to have a conversation about getting work supports for you as well as we build our family and tie child support and the financial responsibilities into it. But we need dads to be more nurturers. This whole notion of your heart changing, this notion about having a nanny when you hold your daughter, father presence matters.
But and how do we convey that? I mean, you say more than it has to be in the news, but I mean, doesn't there have to be you write a newspaper column, doesn't there have to be don't the media have to change their attitude, not just in TV shows, not just in news shows, not just in newspapers, but in sitcoms and how we portray fathers' roles, period?
Well, we have to portray roles accurately, first of all. And when you do that, you get sort of a mixed picture, or maybe sometimes even an awful picture. I sat down with about 15 young men at a correctional treatment facility in the district. All were had committed homicides. And I asked them, how many of you are fathers? They're young men. How many are fathers? And most of them raised their hands. And I said, okay, let's go around the room. How many kids do you have? One, two, three. Guy said, 3. I said, okay, what are the ages? He said, 3. I said, no. You have 3 kids, but what are their ages? He said, 3. Triplets? No. 3 different women. Father completely not only disconnected from the mother, disconnected from 3 different children, 3 different women.
Where's the shame in this? I mean, you talk about what the media can do, what sort of entertainment and culture could do. I would love to see a dramatic TV show on CBS, ABC, NBC, wherever, where a situation like that happens and that person is shamed by his community for making those kinds of choices. Not just obviously for being a murderer, of course, but we don't have a culture anymore that shames men who have children and then disappear. I'm not arguing for an Ozzie and Harriet 1950s here, but there was a time in this country where there was tremendous shame attached to that sort of thing. And it kept a lot of couples, not nearly enough, but it kept a lot of couples together. My grandparents' generation was full of those kinds of stories. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, and every summer he had a reunion of his old unit, the survivors anyway, at their house in Cleveland, Ohio. I heard all these stories about, well, you know, we got pregnant and we had to get married. That's what you did back then. And because of that, they had family cohesion. They had a chance to build a bloodline of, you know, of descendants who saw that kind of example. Because the culture said, okay, you did this, now here's what you have to do.
Shall we go back to gunshot weddings?
You know what? Isn't it a lot better than forced, you know, shotgun single parenting?
Well, then this day and age, they don't last very long. I mean, divorce is also a lot more popular.
That's a whole different show.
But you're right, exactly. But point taken, and your thoughts on that?
Well, how about allowing men to really own nurturing as a primary characteristic of our behavior? It's not something that was frontline for me until I became a father, but now that I'm daily, all night, all day, every day caring for my daughter, nurturing is probably my primary characteristic when it comes to engaging with her. As a matter of fact, my father said one of the nicest things he ever said to me recently. He said, of course you're a great father. You're the most nurturing person I've ever known. You know, you can't get better than that.
Okay, but what would have brought, well, you know, you were, before you decided to have a child and you weren't thinking about that side of yourself, what would have drawn it out of you earlier?
You mean becoming a parent earlier?
No, becoming, acknowledging and fostering your nurturing side.
Sure. I mean, I've always led large teams of people professionally in the companies that I've owned or worked for, and so I found that a lot of my behavior there, while I didn't name it as nurturing, often helped them advance forward in their careers and become achieving professionals.
Mentoring?
Mentoring, yeah, that's a great
They're really
word.
two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yes,
we
they
mentor
are.
adults, we nurture children, but it comes from the same part of our DNA.
But
I'm convinced of it.
I liked the way my father was a father. I wanted to be a father. He wanted to be a father. The saddest day I had was when my kids grew up and left. I enjoyed having them there. I enjoyed every second with them. I see people now with kids, I say, and they're complaining because the kid is crying. I said, look, enjoy this moment. Because one day it'll be gone and you will miss it.
But how would you get those young men you were talking to in the correctional facility to feel that way before they started having unprotected sex with women they obviously didn't have relationships with?
Okay, and Joe will jump on this, but we have this family structure situation problem that we have to cope with. We don't have a lot of two-parent families. We have a lot of women raising their kids by themselves.
It's true in the black community where it's something like 70%, but it's true across the country because it's now 30% or more of all children being raised, brought into the world by single mothers.
You have to complement that. You have to supplement that. There has to be some other force coming into the picture to help that individual. If for no other reason than to make sure that the children who are there are seeing good examples to follow, better examples to follow. You have to have the presence of uncles and cousins and neighbors, people who are standing in the community who come into the lives of these kids so that they get an example see examples of men in positive roles. You know more about this than I do as a professional, but this is what I think. You can't just throw up your hands and say, well, we'll work with the mother and do what we can with the mother. She has to have help, needs to be intervention.
All right, we'll get a little more into this in the next segment. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To the Contrary. From father's roles to HeForShe.
The UN's HeForShe campaign continues to gain male partners around the globe. The campaign is dedicated to achieving gender equality by engaging men in the fight for women's rights, but it will need a big push to reach its goal of signing up 1 billion men. So far, 325,000 men have joined, including 77,000 Americans. UN Women recently honored Iceland as the most mobilized nation, attracting 1 in 20 men. The project also wants to engage governments, corporations, men's organizations, universities, and schools. Its goal is to get men and boys to take responsibility for eliminating all forms of discrimination against women and violence against women and girls.
So, Chris, is it possible to get a significant portion of men in this world? We're over 7 billion people at this point, presumably about 3.5 million or something there, about 3.5 billion are men. And so far, 375,000 of them have agreed to take on owning sex discrimination, owning gender violence, and agreeing to fight it. Is this a pipe dream, or is it just going to be a small percentage of men, or could it be brought to a wider scale?
It's baby steps. It's cultural. It's been in our society for a long time in terms of how men are raised to think about women, especially in some of the emerging markets around the world. You've seen the statistics. It's something that we can help move the needle forward on through programs like this. However, it will take quite a long time.
When men go through your program, do you see them becoming feminists or the equivalent of fighting for gender equality for their women too, or do they just become better, not just, but become better fathers without the becoming more supportive of their girlfriends and wives' education and careers too?
So I'm a little underhanded, right? I'm sneaky. So I'm trying to be strategic when I work with our guys, right? I know our guys are sharp, they're smart, and they come from a culture where we accept a lot of the nonsense that has gone on. So we really work very closely with the House of Ruth Maryland, premier domestic violence shelter, to provide information education to every guy who goes through the program. So there's a baseline of information, and then we, when there's an acute issue, then we can provide services through that resource. But, on the sneaky side, you can have a conversation with the guys that I work with, and all the guys I work with are low income, age 18 to 35 in general, right? And so they may have a conversation that's germane to their culture, the nuances within how they are raised, right? But then when you start talking to them about their daughters and how they want their daughters treated by men as they start to make partner selection, then you change the discourse, right? And so I understand where they're coming from, and I'm not trying to be prescriptive, so I try to get in where I can fit in, and where I can get in and fit in is when I start talking to them about their daughters. Then you start seeing the wheels of justice in their head changing a little bit.
All right, we have very short amount of time left because we went over on the last scintillating topic, but Colby, in a minute, tell me your thoughts on that point. How do you get men to say, okay, my gender is, if I am not personally, but my gender is responsible for domestic violence, it's responsible for sex discrimination, and then what do you get them to do with that?
Well, you have to get them first to understand what the problem is because of that, before you get around to the solution. You need to understand the impact of my insensitivity, the impact of my lack of appreciation for gender equality, and the thing is the economics of it. Once they understand that economically it's in their best interest to have gender equality, for the person that you're with to not be earning half of what you're getting, but more of what you're getting. In my household, I'm proud to say my wife's the breadwinner.
Very quickly, David.
I think all this petition feminism is very much a first world problem. If you really want to make a difference in women's lives around the world, let's start with making sure Saudi women can drive and Yazidis and Kurdish women aren't sold as child bride slaves at 14. Those kinds of problems, people who are pushing this campaign, the Emma Watsons and all those, they could actually roll up their sleeves and do something about that, but that's very hard work. And I challenge you to come back in 10 years and show me how many of those 375,000 people still remember signing the petition.
All right, that's we're out of town. From HeForShe to She Bills.
It looks like the Treasury Department got the hint, sort of. The government says it will feature a woman on the $10 bill, but she won't be alone. The decision follows a highly visible campaign, Women on 20s, that advocated for a woman to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. The administration seeks public input on which woman's face should grace the bill. The hashtag, the new 10, is being used to share opinions. Women suggested range from Harriet Tubman to Eleanor Roosevelt. The $10 bill will be redesigned and will still include Alexander Hamilton. New notes will begin circulating in 2020, marking the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote.
And that is it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. Where are you guys? What do you think about the woman split? A woman on the 10 instead of the 20? Does it matter?
I think we should do all of them. So we have the woman and a rotating thing. Every time we replace the supply bills that change, it should reflect the culture. And we used to have, Martha Walker.